The lecture hall at the Galactic University of Strategic Studies stretched wide enough to hold students from 40 different worlds. And on this particular morning, it buzzed with the usual mix of clicking mandibles, harmonic hums, and the occasional burst of bioluminescent communication that passed for conversation among the various species present. Professor Zelther stood at the front of the massive chamber, his forearms gesturing elegantly toward the weapon displays that lined the walls like trophies in a champion's vault. Each weapon rested on a floating platform, bathed in soft light that made them look more like religious artifacts than tools of war. The professor's chitinous faceplates shifted in what his students had learned to recognize his pride. "Welcome to Advanced Weapon Theory," Zelther announced, his voice translating through the universal communication devices each student wore. "You are looking at 300 years of collection, 50 weapons that represent the absolute pinnacle of military design from across our known galaxy." The students, a mix of scales, fur, exoskeletons, and stranger things, leaned forward with reverence. A Corthian student with 6 eyes made a whistling sound that meant deep appreciation. Valkyrie princess touched her chest in a gesture of respect. Even the massive Kralix warrior in the back row, who normally showed emotion only through violent action, nodded his boulder-sized head. Then there was Kevin Brooks. The human sat 3 rows from the front, looking distinctly out of place among beings who had evolved on worlds with different gravity, different atmospheres, and very different ideas about what constituted proper student behavior. His hand shot up before the professor had finished speaking. Zelther's antennae twitched with mild annoyance, but he gestured for the human to speak. "Yes, Student Brooks? Why does that plasma rifle have a 17-step firing sequence?" Kevin asked, pointing to a sleek weapon that glowed with inner fire. The other students turned to stare. Several made sounds that the translation devices struggled to process, though the general sentiment seemed to be shock at questioning the professor. On the first take, Zelther's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement or irritation. The Zypherian Mark 7 plasma rifle is a masterpiece of engineering, he explained with exaggerated patience. Each step in its firing sequence ensures perfect energy distribution, optimal targeting calculation, and the what if you need to shoot something quickly. Kevin interrupted. The lecture hall went silent. Even the students who communicated through chemical signals seemed to freeze. Professor Zelther's 4 arms crossed in a defensive posture. "Student Brooks, perhaps on your primitive world, speed takes precedence over precision," he said, his tone carrying an edge that the translators conveyed perfectly. "However, civilized warfare requires, respectfully, Professor, wars are usually won by whoever shoots first, not whoever shoots prettiest," Kevin replied. He stood up, pulling out a small datapad. "I did some reading before class, and according to the Zypherian military records, soldiers spent an average of 47 seconds preparing this rifle for each shot, which meant they died a lot while counting to 17. Ripple of whispers spread through the class. The Kralix warrior made a rumbling sound. That was definitely laughter. Professor Zelther's faceplates shifted through several colors. "The records you reference are from early deployment," he countered. "Trained soldiers could reduce the sequence to 32 seconds. Still seems like a long time to wait when someone's shooting at you," Kevin said. Sitting back down for the next 2 hours, Professor Zelther walked the class through his collection, explaining the history, the craftsmanship, and the cultural significance of each weapon. And for the next 2 hours, Kevin Brooks raised his hand with troubling frequency. Why did the Korvath Battleblade require its wielder to recite a prayer before activation? Wouldn't the ornamental spikes on the Draxian war staff catch on things? Had anyone actually tested whether the Valkyrie pulse lance worked in temperatures below freezing? By the end of class, half the students were taking notes on Kevin's questions instead of the professor's answers. And Professor Zelther looked like he regretted accepting the human exchange program as the students filed out, chattering in their various languages about this unexpected disruption to academic routine. The professor called Kevin to the front. "Student Brooks," Zelther said, all four arms now planted firmly on his desk. "I sense you have concerns about traditional weapon design." "Not concerns exactly," Kevin said, walking down the steps between the tiered seats. "More like questions, you know? These weapons are beautiful, don't get me wrong, but I keep wondering if anyone actually used them." "Used them?" The professor's antennae stood straight up. These weapons conquered empires. The Zoranathi battle scepter alone was carried into 40 successful campaigns. He gestured to an ornate staff mounted on the central display, its surface covered in glowing runes and crystalline structures that pulsed with barely contained energy. Kevin walked over to examine it, his head tilting in that peculiar human way that indicated thinking. "It's really impressive," he admitted. "But can I ask, how much does it weigh?" 47 standard units, Professor Zelther said proudly. The density of the power core alone required. 47? Kevin looked startled. "That's like, what, 90 pounds? Who can carry that into battle?" "The Zoranathi are a strong species. Strong enough to sprint while carrying 90 pounds? Strong enough to fight hand-to-hand after marching with it? Strong enough to use it while injured?" Kevin's questions came rapid-fire. "And these runes, they're beautiful. But do they serve a function or are they decorative? Because if they're just decorative, that's a lot of extra weight for looks." Professor Zelther felt something he hadn't experienced in nearly a century of teaching. "Doubt, I am assigning an essay," he announced abruptly. "Each student will select one weapon from this collection and write a detailed analysis of its perfection, its absolute ideal design that makes it a masterpiece of military engineering." The other students, who had lingered to watch this exchange, groaned at the homework. Kevin just nodded. "Can I choose the battle scepter?" he asked. Professor Zelther's mandibles curved into a smile. "Perfect. The most complex, most culturally significant, most thoroughly documented weapon in the entire collection. This human would spend weeks researching its brilliance and hopefully learn some humility in the process. An excellent choice." The professor said, "I look forward to reading your analysis of its perfection." "Great," Kevin said with genuine enthusiasm. "I'll need to take some measurements, though. Maybe run some stress tests? Do you have the maintenance records?" "Oh, and has anyone ever actually fired one? Or are they all museum pieces now?" Professor Zelther's smile faded. "Measurements? Well, yeah," Kevin said, pulling out a small measuring device from his bag. "Can't really analyze something properly without data, right? My dad always says you can't improve what you don't measure. This is not about improvement," the professor said firmly. "This is about understanding existing perfection." Kevin's face scrunched up in confusion. Another peculiarly human expression. "But if something's perfect, shouldn't it work perfectly? And if it doesn't work perfectly, doesn't that mean there's room for improvement?" As Kevin left the lecture hall, still chattering about measurement protocols and field testing conditions, Professor Zelther sat down heavily in his chair. 300 years of collecting, 300 years of study, and in one morning, a human child had him questioning everything. The worst part? Some of those questions didn't have good answers. The professor looked up at his beloved battle scepter, seeing it for the first time, not as a symbol of military might, but as a 90-pound weight covered in decorative runes. He wondered, just for a moment, what an actual Zoranathi soldier had thought while carrying it. Then he shook his head, dismissing the thought. The human was young, inexperienced, and clearly didn't understand the difference between crude functionality and elegant design. This essay assignment would teach him properly. It had to. The following week, Kevin Brooks stood at the front of Professor Zelther's lecture hall with a presentation that made the other students lean forward with interest and made the professor's antennae droop with growing concern on the large holographic display behind Kevin. A three-dimensional model of the Zoranathi battle scepter rotated slowly. But this wasn't the reverent museum piece the class had admired. This version was covered in measurements, stress analysis charts, and what appeared to be failure points marked in bright red. So I spent the week analyzing the battle scepter. Kevin began, his tone enthusiastic and completely unaware of the professor's darkening mood. And I have to say, it's really interesting from an engineering perspective. We are eager to hear your conclusions about its perfection, Professor Zelther said, though his mandibles clicked with tension. Right, well, about that, Kevin pulled up a weight distribution chart. The first thing I noticed is the balance is really off. Like really off. He used a laser pointer to highlight the scepter's ornate head, where most of the crystalline power structures clustered. See, all the heavy components are up here at the top, which means the center of gravity is way up high, which means whoever's holding this thing has to constantly fight against it, trying to tip forward. A Valkyrie student raised her elegant hand. Perhaps the Zoranathi are strong enough that this does not matter? Maybe, Kevin conceded. But strength isn't the issue, physics is the issue. And physics doesn't care how strong you are. When you're swinging something with bad balance, you waste energy fighting the weapon instead of fighting the enemy. He clicked to the next image, which showed the energy cell placement. Then there's this, the power core is buried inside these decorative layers, which looks amazing. But it means you can't replace it without basically disassembling the whole scepter. Professor Zelther's forearms crossed defensively. The Zoranathi power cores last for 500 charges. Right. But what happens on charge 501? Kevin interrupted. According to the maintenance logs you gave me access to, replacing a depleted core takes 6 hours with specialized tools. Which means if you're in an extended battle and your weapon dies, you're basically holding a really expensive club. The Krlik's warrior in the back row made his rumbling laugh sound again. Human makes good point, he said in his deep voice. Krlik's battle axes need only new edge. Takes 10 minutes. Kevin nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. And look at these runes. They're beautiful. I mean, seriously gorgeous craftsmanship. But see how they stick out from the surface. He zoomed in on the intricate carved patterns. Every single one of these is a catch point. Snagging on clothing, equipment, vegetation, you name it. And in a combat situation, getting your weapon caught on something can get you killed. Silence fell over the lecture hall students who had spent years learning to appreciate the aesthetic perfection of ancient weapons. Suddenly saw them through different eyes. Practical eyes, survival eyes, human eyes. Professor Zelther stood slowly, all forearms spreading in a gesture that demanded attention. Student Brooks, you are focusing entirely on minor practical concerns while ignoring the cultural significance. The traditional craftsmanship, the proven combat record. But has anyone actually proven it? Kevin asked, his face showing genuine curiosity. Like, has anyone compared soldiers using these scepters versus soldiers using something more practical? Because the Zoranathi won 40 campaigns. Sure, but maybe they won despite the scepters. Not because of them. The professor's faceplates shifted through several colors that the translation devices couldn't quite capture, though the emotional content was clear. Somewhere between outrage and existential crisis. The Zoranathi Empire conquered 40 systems with these weapons, he repeated. His voice tight. Kevin pulled up another chart. Actually, I looked into that, and yeah, they conquered 40 systems. But they also lost battles in 73 systems. And when I cross-referenced the casualty reports, which are public record. By the way, A lot of Zoranathi soldiers died from equipment failure, exhaustion from carrying heavy weapons, or injuries sustained because they couldn't maneuver effectively. He paused, looking at the professor with honest concern. I'm not trying to be disrespectful, I promise. But I keep wondering, how many more systems could they have taken if their weapons were actually designed for the people using them instead of for looking impressive? A Dorothian student with translucent wings spoke up. My people also have ceremonial weapons, she said quietly. We use different ones for actual combat. Same, added a student from the Kryn Collective. Traditional weapons for parades, practical weapons for war. Professor Zelther looked around his classroom and saw something that terrified him. Students thinking critically about things he had taught them to revere without question. Perhaps, he said slowly, trying to regain control, we should examine the human approach to weapons design. Since student Brooks seems to find our methods so lacking, Kevin brightened immediately. Oh, I brought examples. He pulled out a datapad and connected it to the classroom display. Images of human weapons filled the screen. Crude, kinetic firearms, simple bladed weapons. Basic but effective tools of war. The alien students leaned in, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed disdain. These are primitive, a Cytherian student said, her three voices harmonizing in dismissal. Projectile weapons using chemical combustion? We abandoned such crude technology millennia ago. Yeah, they're pretty simple, Kevin agreed cheerfully. But see, that's kind of the point. Every human soldier can field strip and reassemble any of these weapons blindfolded, in the dark. While under fire, he pulled up a video of a human soldier doing exactly that. We don't make weapons complicated, because complicated means more parts that can break, more training required. More ways for things to go wrong when you need them to go right. Professor Zelther studied the images with growing discomfort. Human weapons were ugly, no decorative elements. No cultural symbolism. Number aesthetic consideration at all. Just brutal functionality. Your weapons have no soul, he said finally. No connection to your history, your traditions, your identity as a species. Kevin considered this seriously. I guess that's true in a way, he admitted. But we figure staying alive is more important than looking good while dying. We put our culture into things that won't get us killed, you know? Art, music, stories, weapons are just tools. And tools should work. The class discussion continued for another hour, with students beginning to share their own observations about traditional weapons from their cultures. The Krolix warrior admitted that ceremonial battle axes were twice as heavy as practical ones. The Volcari princess quietly noted that royal pulse lances required specific hand anatomy that only the aristocracy possessed. A student from a crystalline species confessed that their traditional weapons shattered in cold temperatures. Professor Zelther listened to all of this with growing horror. 300 years of collecting, of studying, of teaching. Had he been wrong about everything? As the class ended and students filed out in animated conversation, the professor found himself staring at his prize collection with new eyes. These weren't just weapons. They were symbols of civilizations that had valued pride over practicality, tradition over survival, appearance over function. How many soldiers had died carrying these beautiful, impractical, culturally significant death traps? Kevin approached the professor's desk, his datapad still in hand. Professor, I hope I didn't overstep, he said with genuine concern. I really do think these weapons are incredible works of art. I just don't think they're good weapons. If that makes sense. Zelther looked at the young human and felt something shift in his understanding. Student Brooks, he said quietly, would you be willing to help me with a research project? Sure. What kind of research? The professor gestured to his collection. I want to actually test these weapons, real field conditions, real combat scenarios, not theoretical analysis. I want to know if they actually work the way I have been teaching they work. Kevin's face lit up. That would be amazing. Oh man, we could set up controlled tests, measure actual performance versus theoretical performance, compare different designs. There is a practical demonstration competition next month. The professor interrupted. Students use assigned weapons in combat simulations. I had planned to give you the Valkyrie pulse lance, which I considered the easiest weapon in my collection. He paused, his mandibles clicking thoughtfully. Now I find myself wondering if I gave it to you because it is easy, or because it is the one least likely to get you killed. Kevin looked at the elegant lance mounted on its display platform. Only one way to find out, he said with a grin that Professor Zelther was learning meant trouble. Only one way indeed, the professor agreed, wondering what he had just set in motion. The combat simulation arena stretched across 3 levels of the university's training facility, filled with obstacles, cover points, and holographic enemies that looked and acted disturbingly. Real 20 students from Professor Zelther's class stood in the preparation area, each assigned one of the professor's prized weapons, each about to discover whether beauty and functionality could coexist. Professor Zelther watched from the observation deck, his forearms gripping the railing with uncharacteristic tension. Beside him stood Dean Corthax, a massive being whose species had conquered 12 systems through military might. Your collection gets field tested today, the dean rumbled, his voice like grinding stones. Should be interesting to see theory meet practice. The first student entered the arena, a Cytherian named Velisa, who had drawn the Kryn harmonic blade, a weapon that supposedly could cut through any material by vibrating at precise frequencies. The holographic enemies appeared. 5 combat drones programmed to realistic military tactics. Velisa activated the blade, which immediately began humming with power, and charged forward with the confidence of someone who had studied this weapon's legendary status for weeks. The blade cut through the first drone beautifully. Then, the vibrations traveled up the handle and numbed Velisa as 3 arms. She dropped the weapon, stumbled, and the simulation ended with her virtual death in 47 seconds. Success rate, 12%. Next came Corthax, a student from a warrior species. Wielding the Drolthian plasma bow, the weapon looked magnificent. Curved energy emitters, ornate focusing crystals, power readings that promised devastating destruction. Corthax drew the energy string, aimed at a drone, and fired. The plasma bolt went wide left. He adjusted, fired again wide right. The focusing crystals, it turned out, required calibration for each user's unique bioelectric field, a process that took approximately 3 hours' time. Corthax didn't have as the drones overwhelmed him. Success rate, 28%. Student after student entered the arena. Student after student discovered that museum pieces made terrible combat tools. The ornate Valkyrie shield generator looked spectacular but overheated. After 90 seconds of continuous use, the legendary Zypherian plasma rifle with its 17-step firing sequence got its user killed before they finished step 12. The quantum disruption staff required a specific meditation technique before activation, which was difficult to maintain while being shot at. Professor Zelther watched his prize collection fail in real combat conditions, and with each failure, something inside him cracked. These weren't just weapons. They were his life's work, his legacy, his contribution to military academia. Average success rate so far, 61%, Dean Corthax observed, making notes on his datapad. Not terrible, but not impressive for supposed legendary weapons. Then it was Kevin Brooks' turn. The human walked into the arena carrying the Valkyrie pulse lance, and Professor Zelther felt a strange mixture of hope and dread. The lance was elegant, powerful, and according to 300 years of Valkyrie military tradition, perfect. Kevin held it awkwardly, clearly feeling the weight distribution issues he had mentioned in class. The simulation began. 5 drones appeared, then 10. Then 15. The program designed to increase difficulty until the student failed. Kevin didn't charge forward like the other students. Instead, he moved carefully, using cover, keeping the lance pointed down when not actively firing. The first drone appeared around a corner. Kevin fired. The lance's trigger was hair-sensitive, something the instruction manual called a feature for quick response. Kevin called it a safety hazard and used it anyway. But carefully, deliberately, the shot hive moved position immediately, not staying in one place. Another drone, another careful shot. Professor Zelther leaned forward, watching the human's tactics. Kevin wasn't trying to use the weapon the way it was designed. He was adapting his fighting style to work around the weapon's flaws. When the lance's power indicator showed 70% higher than recommended for safety, Kevin stopped firing at full power and switched to half power. Shots that used less energy but still disabled the drones effectively. When the ornamental grip began to slip in his hands from the sweat of exertion, he adjusted his hold to a less traditional but more secure position. When the lance's recoil compensators designed for Valkyrie physiology failed to work properly with human biomechanics, Kevin braced differently, compensated manually, adapted. The drone count reached 20 fan 25. Kevin kept moving, kept thinking, kept surviving at 30 drones. He made a decision that horrified the watching Valkyrie students. He stopped using the lance as a ranged weapon entirely and started using it as a club, smashing disabled drones to conserve power at 33 drones. The simulation ended not because Kevin died, but because he had survived the maximum duration success rate, 94%, the highest score in the class using a weapon he had openly criticized as flawed. The arena fell silent as Kevin emerged, sweating and breathing hard, but very much alive. Dean Korthax looked at his datapad, then at Professor Zelther, then back at his datapad. "Well," he said simply. The other students crowded around Kevin, asking questions in a dozen languages. "How did you do that? Why did you use half power? The grip technique you used is not standard." Kevin set the lance down carefully, and Professor Zelther noticed that the human's hands were shaking slightly. "That weapon is dangerous," Kevin said bluntly. "The trigger sensitivity nearly made me shoot my own foot twice. The power core doesn't have any safety cutoff, so it could have overloaded and exploded. The balance is so bad that my arms are cramping, and there's no safety mechanism whatsoever." He looked at the professor. "I survived despite the weapon, not because of it. If I had trusted it completely, if I had used it the way the manual says, I would have died in the first minute." The Valkyrie princess, who had been so reverent about the lance, stepped forward, her elegant features tight with emotion. "You disrespected our traditions," she said, her voice carrying an edge. "I survived," Kevin replied simply. "Would your traditions prefer I die correctly rather than live incorrectly?" She had no answer for that. Professor Zelther descended from the observation deck. His movements slow and deliberate, he stood before his class, before his collection of legendary weapons, before 300 years of accumulated assumptions. "I need to ask you all a question," he said quietly, "and I need honest answers. How many of you have relatives who died in combat using traditional weapons?" Silence then. Slowly hands began to rise. The Krolix warrior raised his massive hand. "Grandfather," he said, his deep voice rough. "Ceremonial rifle jammed during border conflict. Enemy had simple projectile weapons that worked." A Drolthian student spoke up, her wings trembling. "My sister's entire squadron. Their elegant fighters had beautiful energy cores that took 3 minutes to charge. Between shots, more stories, more deaths, more examples of tradition killing. People who trusted it." The Valkyrie princess spoke last, her voice barely above a whisper. "My mother," she said, "champion duelist, 40 victories, died because her ceremonial pulse lance overheated and she could not release it fast enough. She looked at the lance Kevin had just used, this same model. Professor Zelther felt something break inside him completely. "I have taught you all to revere weapons that killed your families," he said, the words tasting like ashes. "I have spent 300 years collecting instruments of death and calling them instruments of perfection." Dean Korthax placed a heavy hand on the professor's shoulder. "You taught what you believed," he said. "Now you know better. The question is, what will you do with that knowledge?" Kevin raised his hand, hesitant. "Professor, I don't think the weapons themselves are bad. They're incredible engineering, amazing art, important cultural artifacts. They're just not combat tools anymore, you know? Maybe they never were. Maybe they were always symbols, and somewhere along the way everyone forgot that symbols are meant to inspire the living, not kill them." The professor looked at his student, this strange human from a harsh world, who questioned everything and realized that sometimes the best teachers are the ones willing to learn. "Student Brooks," he said formally, "how would you feel about helping me redesign this course?" Kevin's face split into that troublesome grin. "Only if we actually test everything," he said. "No more assuming things work because they're supposed to. If it can't save your life, it's not a weapon. It's just a pretty sculpture that happens to shoot." Professor Zelther looked at his collection one last time as a curator. Then he looked at it again as an educator. The difference was terrifying and necessary. "Class dismissed," he announced. "When we return next week, we will begin again. This time, we will question everything." As the students filed out, excited and chattering about this dramatic shift, Dean Korthax chuckled. 300 years of certainty destroyed by one human in 3 weeks, he observed. "Yes," Professor Zelther agreed. "And perhaps that is exactly what I needed." The firing range smelled of ozone and scorched metal, which Kevin Brooks thought was much more appropriate for a weapons course than the sterile museum atmosphere of the lecture hall. Professor Zelther stood to the side, all forearms crossed, watching his student prepare to teach his class a sentence that would have been unthinkable 4 weeks ago. "Welcome to Practical Weapons Analysis," Kevin announced to the assembled students. "Today we're not going to talk about how weapons should work in theory. We're going to find out how they actually work in practice." He gestured to 15 weapons from the professor's collection, now laid out on field tables instead of floating on display pedestals. "Everyone picks a weapon, and then we're going to actually use them. Not in simulation, not in theory, but really use them." The Volcari princess, whose name was Lyra, raised her hand. "Is this not disrespectful to the cultural significance?" Kevin shook his head. "My dad worked construction his whole life, and he always said you respect a tool by using it properly, not by putting it on a shelf. These weapons were made to be used, so let's use them and find out what their makers actually intended." The students moved forward, selecting weapons with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. The Krolix warrior, whose name was Throg, picked up his own species' ceremonial warhammer. "This killed many enemies," he said proudly, hefting the massive weapon. "Great," Kevin said. "Now try to carry it at combat speed for 200 meters." Throg began jogging, the hammer held ready. At 50 meters, his breathing became labored. At 100 meters, he slowed significantly. At 150 meters, he set the hammer down, his massive chest heaving. "Combat speed not possible for distance," he admitted. "Hammer too heavy for extended movement." "But does it need to be that heavy?" Kevin asked. "What if we took the ceremonial engravings off? What if we used lighter materials for the decorative parts?" Throg looked at the hammer with new eyes. "Would still hit hard," he said slowly. "Would hit just as hard with half the weight." A Cytherian student named Kyle Sith held the harmonic blade that had numbed Valissa during the simulation. "The vibrations are the problem," she observed, her 3 voices harmonizing concern. "Right," Kevin agreed. So why does it need to vibrate at that specific frequency? Tradition says, but what does physics say? Kevin interrupted gently. Try adjusting the frequency. The controls are right there on the handle. Kyle Sith experimented. Lowering the vibration rate, the blade still cut through the target material, but without the numbing feedback, it works, she said. Surprise evident in all three vocal tones. It works better, Professor Zelther. Watched as student after student made similar discoveries. The plasma rifles. 17-step sequence could be reduced to 4 without losing effectiveness. The ornamental spikes on the Draxian war staff served no purpose and actively hindered movement. The energy cores that took hours to replace could be redesigned for quick swap if aesthetics weren't the priority. Each revelation felt like a small death to the professor's ego and a larger awakening to his responsibility as an educator. A young Kryn student named Silith approached him during a water break. Professor, I have question, she said, her translator rendering her crystalline chiming into standard speech. Of course. Student Silith, why did you collect weapons that do not work well? Her question held no accusation. Only genuine curiosity. Zelther S. antennae drooped. I collected them because they were famous, because they were beautiful, because they represented the pinnacle of their respective cultures' military achievements. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. I never questioned whether fame and beauty and achievement were the same as effectiveness. But you teach weapon strategy, Silith said. Should not effectiveness be most important? Yes, the professor said simply. Yes, it should. And I failed to remember that back on the range. Kevin had the students doing stress tests, actually firing the weapons repeatedly to find failure points. Elegant Velkari pulse lance overheated after 47 shots. Not the 200 claimed in the manual. The quantum disruption. Staff's meditation requirement was completely unnecessary. The weapon worked fine with a simple activation thought. The Zoranathi battle scepter that had started. This entire revelation was so unwieldy that 3 different students dropped it during basic maneuvers. As the session continued, something interesting happened. Students stopped defending their cultural weapons and started discussing how to improve them. Throg sketched a redesigned warhammer with us. Lightweight alloys replacing decorative elements. Lyra calculated optimal power core placement for the pulse lance that would allow field replacement. Kalish proposed a vibration dampening system for the harmonic blade that could be retrofitted to existing models. Kevin moved among them, offering suggestions, but mostly listening. And Professor Zelther realized something profound. The human wasn't teaching them to abandon their traditions. He was teaching them to honor their traditions by making them work. By taking beautiful cultural symbols and transforming them back into functional tools that could actually save lives. Professor, Kevin called, waving him over. Can you help explain the theoretical basis for energy distribution in the plasma weapons? I know the practical stuff, but you understand the deep physics way better than I do. Zelther joined the group of students gathered around the Xipherium plasma rifle for the next hour. He explained the theoretical framework while Kevin demonstrated the practical applications. And together they mapped out how the weapon could be redesigned to be both culturally respectful and actually functional. As the class ended and students filed out with datapads full of notes and ideas, Kevin approached the professor. That was great, he said enthusiastically. Did you see how engaged everyone was? This is what education should be. Not just memorizing what worked before, but figuring out how to make it work better. Student Brooks, the professor said quietly, I need to apologize to you. Kevin looked surprised. For what? When you first arrived, I thought you were disrespectful, ignorant of the cultural significance of these weapons. I assigned you the Battle Scepter essay, hoping it would humble you, teach you to appreciate tradition. Oh, Kevin said, Did I seem disrespectful? I really didn't mean. You were not disrespectful, Zelther interrupted. You were honest. And I confused honest questioning with disrespect because I had spent so long refusing to question myself. He gestured to the weapons on the tables. I built my career on teaching students to revere these weapons, to see them as untouchable paragons of design. You taught me that true respect means wanting things to work, wanting them to save lives instead of taking them. Kevin was quiet for a moment. My grandfather was a soldier, he said finally. He survived 3 wars, and you know what he told me? He said the best weapon is the one you trust completely. And you can only trust something that's designed for you to survive, not designed for you to look good. Your grandfather was a wise man. He was, Kevin agreed. And he also said that the people who question things aren't trying to tear them down, they're trying to make them better. I think he would have liked your weapons, but he would have wanted to modify them, you know? Make them work for real soldiers instead of just looking impressive, Professor. Zelther looked at his collection, his former pride, with completely different eyes. Next week, I am going to propose a new course, he said. Comparative weapons analysis, theory and practice. I would like you to be my teaching assistant. Really? Kevin's face lit up. But I'm just a student. You are a student who changed 300 years of teaching in less than a month. The professor said, you are a student who made me realize I had stopped being an educator and had become a curator. You are a student who cares more about saving lives than preserving pride. He extended one of his forearms in the traditional gesture of respect between teacher and student. You have taught me far more than I have taught you. And that makes you precisely the kind of teaching assistant this course needs. Kevin shook the extended arm. Grinning, does this mean I can suggest more changes? I am afraid to ask, but yes. Okay, so I was thinking, what if we actually brought in soldiers? Like, people who use these weapons in real combat. They could tell us what actually worked and what didn't. Straight from experience, Professor Zelther's antennae perked up. That is actually brilliant. Why have I never done that? Because you were asking historians and engineers instead of users, Kevin said. But users are the ones who know if something really works, as they walked back toward the main campus. Professor Zelther felt lighter than he had in decades. The weight of assumed knowledge had been crushing him without him realizing it. Student Brooks, may I ask you something? Sure. On Earth, when someone questions established knowledge, how do people typically react? Kevin laughed. Usually they get mad at first. Tell you you're wrong. Defend the old way. But then, if you're respectful and you have evidence, they eventually listen well. Some of them do. Anyway, and those who do not listen, they get left behind, Kevin said simply. Progress doesn't wait for permission. Professor Zelther stopped walking. I very nearly got left behind, he said quietly. But you didn't, Kevin pointed out. You listened. You changed. You're still here. That's what matters. The professor looked at his student, this peculiar human, who had dismantled 3 centuries of certainty with nothing but honest questions. The department review committee met in a chamber designed to intimidate, with high ceilings, formal seating arrangements, and an atmosphere that suggested judgment was coming and would not be. Gentle Professor Zelther sat at the respondents' table, his forearms resting on the polished surface. With forced calm across from him sat 5 department heads representing different colleges within the university. And at the center sat Dean Corthax, whose expression suggested this hearing would determine more than just curriculum changes. We are here to discuss the recent alterations to advanced weapon theory, Dean Corthax began, his rumbling voice filling the chamber. Professor Zelther, you have taught this course for 73 years without incident. In the last month, you have completely restructured it based on input from a first-year exchange student. That is correct, Zelther replied. Some faculty members have expressed concern, added Professor Sylvain, head of the Historical Preservation Department. Her crystalline form, refracting light in agitated patterns. They suggest you are abandoning cultural traditions in favor of crude practicality. I am teaching students to survive, Zelther said simply. If that conflicts with tradition, then perhaps tradition needs examination. Murmurs rippled through the observers' gallery, where students and faculty had gathered to watch Professor Velmarix, head of military strategy, leaned forward. Your students' performance in the practical demonstration improved by 300% after implementing these changes, he said, his scaled face unreadable. That is statistically significant. It is also culturally destructive. Professor Sylvain insisted. These weapons represent centuries of development, artistic achievement, symbolic meaning. They also represent centuries of soldiers dying unnecessarily. A voice interrupted from the gallery. Everyone turned to see Throg standing, his massive frame impossible to miss. Permission to speak? He asked Dean Korthax. Dean gestured approval. My grandfather died because he trusted a ceremonial weapon in combat, Throg said, his deep voice carrying clearly. The rifle was beautiful, historically significant, culturally important, and it jammed when he needed it most. Enemy soldiers had simple, ugly, practical weapons that worked. He looked at Professor Sylvain. What good is cultural preservation if everyone who carries that culture dies? Lyra, the Velkari princess, stood next. My mother was a champion duelist, she said, her elegant voice steady despite the emotion behind it. She died because her traditional pulse lance overheated. Professor Zelthor's new approach taught me why it failed and how it could be improved without losing its cultural identity. More students stood, each sharing stories of relatives, friends, fellow soldiers who had died because tradition valued appearance over effectiveness. The committee members listened, their expressions shifting. This is all very moving, Professor Sylvain said, though her tone suggested she found it anything but. However, emotion does not change the fact that we are discussing the degradation of cultural heritage. With respect, Dean Korthax interrupted, his massive hand raised. Student Brooks, would you approach the committee? Kevin had been sitting quietly in the back, trying to be invisible. But now he walked forward with visible nervousness. Student Brooks, you are the catalyst for these changes, the dean said. What is your perspective? Kevin took a breath. I never meant to destroy anything, he said. I just kept wondering why incredibly smart species would design weapons that made their soldiers' jobs harder. Humans aren't smarter than anyone else. We're probably less advanced than most species here, but we learned something important because Earth is really harsh and unforgiving. He paused, gathering his thoughts. We learned that when your survival depends on something, you don't make it complicated or beautiful or traditional. You make it work. You can add the beauty later, after you're sure it won't kill you. Professor Velmarix nodded thoughtfully. Continue. Professor Zelther didn't abandon culture, Kevin said. Looking at his teacher, he started asking if culture was serving the people or if people were dying to serve culture. Those weapons in his collection are amazing historical artifacts. Incredible art, important cultural symbols. They're just not combat tools anymore. And maybe they never were. Then what are they? Asked Professor Sylvain sharply. They're lessons, Zelther answered, standing to join Kevin. They teach us what happens when we prioritize appearance over function, when we refuse to question tradition, when we value pride more than survival. He gestured to the assembled students. Before Student Brooks arrived, I taught reverence. Now I teach analysis. Before, I taught students to accept. Now I teach them to question. Before, I was preserving the past. Now I am preparing them for the future. Dean Korthax studied both of them. The concern, Professor, is that your methods may produce soldiers who lack respect for military tradition. No. Throg rumbled from the gallery. His methods produce soldiers who live long enough to create new traditions. The dean's expression shifted, not quite a smile, but something close. Professor Velmarx, what is your strategic assessment? The military strategy professor stood. I have reviewed the performance data extensively, he said. Students in the revised course demonstrate superior weapon handling, better critical thinking, faster adaptation to unexpected situations, and significantly improved survival rates in simulations. He paused. They also demonstrate greater respect for the soldiers who use these weapons, because they understand the reality those soldiers faced. That seems more respectful than blind worship. Professor Sylvain made a sound of frustration. You are all missing the fundamental point. Once we start modifying traditional weapons, where does it end? Do we abandon all cultural practices that are not optimally efficient? No, Kevin said quietly. We just stop dying for them. The chamber fell silent. Cultural practices are beautiful, Kevin continued. They connect people to their history, their identity, their community. The weapons aren't cultural practices. They're tools for keeping people alive, so they can continue having culture. He looked at Professor Sylvain directly. You want to preserve culture? Great, preserve it, in ways that don't require soldiers to choose between honoring their ancestors and surviving to see their children. Make the weapons work first, then add the cultural elements in ways that don't compromise functionality. Well said, Dean Korthax rumbled. This committee will now vote on whether to approve Professor Zelther's curriculum changes and expand them to other courses. The vote was 4-1, with only Professor Sylvain dissenting. The changes are approved, Dean Korthax announced. Additionally, we are creating a new course, Practical Weapons Analysis, to be taught by Professor Zelther with student Brooks as teaching assistant. He looked at Zelther. You questioned 300 years of your own expertise because a student made you think. That is the mark of a true educator. As the committee adjourned, students crowded around Kevin and the professor, asking questions about the new course, sharing ideas for practical improvements to traditional weapons, discussing how to balance respect for culture with respect for life. Professor Sylvain approached Zelther, her crystalline form still vibrating with agitation. You have undermined everything this institution stands for, she said. No, Zelther replied calmly. I have remembered what this institution is supposed to stand for. Teaching students to think, not teaching them to memorize. She left without another word. But Zelther found he did not mind. Some people would never accept that questioning tradition could be the highest form of respect later. In the quiet of his office, Zelther added the first human weapon to his collection, a simple kinetic rifle. Mass-produced, aesthetically unremarkable, and ruthlessly functional, he created a new display label. Form follows function. Lives follow form. Kevin examined it and grinned. That's perfect, he said. But you know, now I'm wondering about human medical instruments. We have this thing called a bone saw that looks absolutely brutal, but works really well. And I bet some species have medical tools that are super complicated when they could be simpler. Student Brooks? Zelther interrupted, his antennae waving in alarm. Perhaps we should consolidate our current changes before revolutionizing additional departments. Just a suggestion, Kevin said, laughing. But seriously, the same principle applies, right? If something is supposed to save lives, it should be designed by people who actually use it, not by people who just study it. The professor considered this. You are going to completely rebuild this university's approach to practical education, are not you? Only if the other professors are as smart as you, Kevin replied. Smart enough to listen when someone asks why things are the way they are. Zelther looked at his collection, no longer a shrine to perfection, but a teaching tool for critical thinking, and felt satisfied. 300 years of certainty had been destroyed in a month. And it was the best thing that had ever happened to his teaching career. Student Brooks? Yeah, Professor? Thank you for not letting me be comfortable. Kevin smiled. Thank you for being uncomfortable, he replied. Most people just get defensive and stay wrong. You actually changed, and that's harder. Through the office window, they could see students gathered in groups, discussing weapon designs, sketching improvements, questioning assumptions, a whole generation learning that tradition deserved respect but not blind.